Okay, thank you. Now I would like to start talking a bit more as to where do I get us to go, so to speak. So there is some consensus for the things that you told me, that you think that policy is a statement of a course of action. You said that policy is something that states the purpose or the goals that you are going to follow in order to achieve something. And usually, this sort of set of goals and course of actions in order to achieve those goals are attributed to policymakers, because it's the policymaker the one that does, that writes up the policy. So if we conceive policy as this, then what happens? Would you go one further, please? Thank you. Then what happens in the policy analysis? In the policy analysis, then, what you are trying to do is to try and interpret correctly what the policymakers might have wanted to say. So it's about interpreting the intention of the policymaker, and then policy itself is a mode of communication, the way in which the government communicates its objectives, its intentions to the people. And whether the people are the actual people, individual citizens, or the different institutions in society. Policy then becomes the intention of the author, which of course has a number of implications, because A is the issue of how the author writes the policy and all these kind of things. Of policy as a statement of a course of action, it has implicit a sense of uncomplicated and direct relationship between the policy, the policymaker, the policy implementer, and the public. And if you think these type of direct relationships and uncomplicated relationships are not so, you can take almost any policy in higher education that have been put out since 1997, and not one institution would have implemented that policy or that directive in the same way. And moreover, institutions bring in their own interpretations. So this is not a system of communication in the sense that it is a direct communication. I said hello, you understand that I'm greeting you, and you respond, hi, how are you? It's a much more complicated thing. People, institutions, read into policy. So there is a process of translation, actually, which is a much more complex social and relationship than just simple communication on the surface level. So all of these things we're going to go through slowly, but these are things that I really think that are important for you to stop and think what kind of conceptualization of policy you are assuming in your PhD. And what implications that conceptualization has for the manner in which you are going to analyze that policy. Please interrupt me at any stage. Because now the thing gets more conceptual, probably find much more difficult to be funny or mildly aggressive. So, now, There are many ways of making things more complex, okay? So even within the notion of text, we can have still a much more complex definition of policy than the first one, that policy as a statement of the course of action that policymakers intend to follow. So a second level of complexity is this definition. Policy is any course of action or inaction. So let's stop there. In policy, it is as important what you do than what you do not do. Because you are making choices. And in those choices, you are translating values, you are translating procedures, etc. Let me give you again one example from higher education policy. At the end of the National Commission on Higher Education sitting that happened during 1995, and the Commission produced its report in 1996, there were a number of recommendations about how the higher education system, as governance at the system level, should be organized. And they suggested that the department, the Ministry of Education should have a higher education forum that should include all higher education institutions and stakeholders, etc., should function regularly as a way of having a participative process in policy making and policy implementation, and that a council on higher education should exist as quite a large collective that was going to help setting policy for the ministry. When the act came out, when the white paper came out, that suggestion had been dropped. And the white paper proposed the creation of a branch in the Department of Education that was going to be specialized on higher education, and the creation of a council on higher education as a body advising the Minister on higher education issues. The fact that that suggestion of the 1996 document of the National Commission on Higher Education was dropped was a political choice. And that is very, very important. And there are a number of reasons why that choice was made and why the sort of more participative mass meeting kind of thing was discarded. But these things are not unimportant, okay? Okay, so policy is any course of action or inaction relating to the selection of goals, the definition of values, and the allocation of resources. Policies inevitably refer to allocation of resources. Whatever those resources might be money, concretely, funding, or might be human resources. Might be space in the internet, might be allocation of data, doesn't matter. But there are resources that are allocated to a particular policy. So, and the allocation of resources to a particular thing mean that there are resources that are not being allocated to another thing. Because we don't have endless resources, as you know. So that is a very important thing. Let me give you an interesting example. I mean, this is interesting for me. When we were doing the audits of the different higher education institutions, one of the questions that very few people managed to answer properly, or in an interesting manner, was how the educational priorities of the institutions were reflected in the manner in which the budgets of those institutions were structured. Not one is not quite correct. There were very few institutions in which the budget actually could match their so-called strategic plan. And it is actually fascinating because there are all these great ideas, and how are we going to this and how are we going to that and whatever. Okay, are the resources, the allocation of your staff, how you do this, how you cut the cake of finite resources in order for them to reflect the values of what you're sort of selecting as your values. So if, yes. The money. Yeah. But that's one of the things that fascinates me. You see, I spent 10 years of my life in the system of higher education, so looking at the system from outside and above, so to speak. But now I've been for 4 years in the senior management of a higher education institution. So I had this sort of brilliant opportunity of sitting with the executive of finance at my institution quite often. And I always want to hit my head against the wall. Because it is as if you have, how many Philistines can you choose to run a higher education institution? And it is just extraordinary because there's no conception of what it is that you're trying to do. Or it is a very reductionist type of cost-benefit analysis in terms of what you're doing. Where do you take risk? How you gamble in certain things because the objective is higher. So it's a very interesting thing. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I think that it is very important that we understand what are the consequences of running higher education institutions as if they were enterprises, businesses. And more we are doing that. Not only in the language that we employ, but also in the techniques that we employed for doing this. Anyway, let me not get carried away in the political reasoning. So one policy, if you define policy in this slightly more complex manner, then policy analysis becomes a form of inquiry that provides the informational base upon which a policy is constructed, because then you see, okay, how does this policy come to be? Or you can do the critical examination of existing policies. And this is one of the things that I think it is important for allow us a distinction which Salim used to make very well and other people do, which is the difference between analysis for policy and analysis of policy. There are two very different things. Could we move into the next one, please? When you do analysis for policy, you are basically trying to help government or an institution, doesn't matter, to produce policy. So what you are doing is to take in a certain base of knowledge, trying to comprehend a certain problem in order to inform the production of policy. That's analysis for policy. And that's what allows you to make decisions. One of the things that one of the functions of the organization was to do analysis for policy, to help the government understand what the consequence of certain proposals were going to be, what things should inform. And sometimes the analysis of policy that was post factum. So with the analysis for policy, we help the government think in terms of how to put out a distance education policy. With this analysis of policy, when we look at the whole of the regulatory system in the country and we try and analyze where we were going with the system of cooperative governance, for example. Okay, the next one, please. You do analysis of policy when you determine the effects that the policy has on different sectors of people, on different groups. And when you look at the content of the policy, in terms of the values, the conceptualizations, the ideologies that underline how the policy has been conceptualized and the policy process itself. Okay? So there are two different types of analysis. In all your cases, as far as I can tell, you are doing analysis of policy. And it is important that you are conscious of that. Yes?
Sometimes I think when we write, we set the language analysis for policy, and we actually analysis of policy. So I've seen people saying things like, this policy should be like this, and this, and making sort of recommendations rather than analytical reflection.
Yeah.
So sort of saying, this is the sort of how it is.
No, but I mean, I think it is interesting, and you see, there are a number of tricks about these things also. It is nothing wrong when in a certain context you said that one of the things that you want your thesis to do is to make recommendations as to how this policy could be improved or modified or whatever, and that's perfectly valid. But when you do these type of things, you see, you need to think of the implications of what you are saying. You need to understand where you are sitting and what is it that you are seeing. Because you can't say the government should invest 10% more in this, whatever, in the teaching development grant. You need to understand where the extra 10% is going to come from. Is the 10% extra going to come from a extra top slicing of the total funding of higher education institutions? You are going to have all the vice chancellors killing you. Is it going to come through a reshuffling of the budget vote in Parliament, and therefore we are going to have 10% less for health? So are we going to have distributing less, I don't know, medicines for AIDS or TB because we want to do more teaching development grant? Mister.
I have a question. When you do this analysis for policy, you also offer various options, because at least in certain kinds of analysis, choosing of the base year makes a big difference. If you want to show your country is doing very well, you can choose a particular base year where it's really low, and so that the government can decide, yeah, I prefer this base year rather than something else.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we try when we offer options. We try to offer options. I think that one has to understand. Often it's a matter of scenarios. You know, if you do this thing in this context, yeah, often you build the scenarios.
And do you build the scenarios as in some other countries? Let me put it in a different way. Does the government ask its bureaucracy, for example, to build scenarios which are tailoring it?
Yes, it does. I mean, stats essay is a great case in point. Yeah, a stats essay is a case in point. The manner in which the Department of Basic Education reads the outcomes of every sort of mathematics testing done internationally is an example of how to read these things. Now, we are specialists on that. But at the same time, I mean, this is not the only angle to it. But I mean, yes, sometimes we do that.
Actually analyzing for policy, that element also has to come in that it's...
Well, you know, you can say it or not. I mean, as having to the minister, you need to think how the minister. What do I need to do for the minister to listen to me? What is it possible for the minister to act on? So I cannot tell the minister to go tell the. Let me give you the example of AIDS. Okay, that was a controversial issue in this country. I cannot tell the minister to turn around and tell the president that he's absolutely off the rocker with his idea of HIV/AIDS. Okay? So I need to give the minister an option that it is ethical, that it is intellectually sound, and that it is politically possible. That's the problem with advising for policy. You need to know how to walk the very tight rope of politics, which is very complicated. And the same thing you do. I mean, I cannot tell my vice chancellor, the other way around in the case of my vice chancellor. I have to tell my vice chancellor every time that something that he's going to say, that it is true, that it is right, is going to create the opposite effect of what he wants to achieve. Even if my vice chancellor doesn't want to listen to it, because that's my obligation, that's my job description. And with the ministers, the same thing.
Can I give an example of the CHE documentation around institutional differentiation?
Yes.
There was clear guidance, which was more or less sound.
Yes. Yes. Well, that's how the politics function, because analysis that the stage suggested that we should close the University of the Transkei, and the reaction was political. And the reaction was political. So, you know, policy tries to move within certain limits of rationality, but the politics that go behind that, or above that, or on the side, or whatever, is not always in terms of rationality. There's a different type of political rationality. You know, that the man to have the Transkei closed, and he promised that he was going to march to the Minister of Education if we decide to close UNITRA. So what you say? No, Tata, we are not going to close the thing. And there we are. Well, sort of 24 years of crisis. Anyway, that's one of the things. But like that, I could give you endless other examples of organizations that failed with their duty. Let me give you another more interesting example in which we fail. We, the university that never existed. It's like the X-Files. The X-Files of the University of KZN. Okay? We did not have the guts to say, this is the audit. I'm sorry. Take us to court. See what happens. But it was all there. So, you know. The next one, please. Okay, so these are examples that I took from some of the master's and PhD theses that I have examined or critically read or whatever. I argue that X, doesn't matter what it is, can be a student participation, can be academic development, X can be anything, doesn't matter. Enacts the relationship between universities and society, often cited in policy documents. What does that tell you? Exactly, precisely. It's the indeterminacy of this type of statements that I want to sort of bring to your attention. When you write a thing like this, you leave your examiner wondering, why do you need to put a sentence like this that means very little? First of all, the relationships between universities and societies are multiple. So you need to specify which ones you refer to. Secondly, policies do not necessarily cite, this is a precision about language, but policies do not cite relationships between universities and society. They define, they even create, but they do not cite. If they are citing something else, if you know what I mean. So this is the kind of things that you need to guard yourself against. Empty statements or imprecise you're trying to talk about. What it says is that you're not very sure of what you're trying to discuss. So that's a no-go. Then is this other story that I was telling you about simplifying the manner in which things get sort of diffused or disseminated around the world. X then spread from the UK to other countries. It traveled in an aeroplane and spread like a virus. It was an epidemic of X, sort of started in the UK and quickly got into South Africa. So these things do not happen like that. There is not a sort of unilineal or monolineal or whatever diffusion of policy. It's not ever a one-on-one. A country is a big thing. I mean, how do things get from the UK here? You know, through the literature that people were producing, so the Society of Higher Research, through the influence of the QAA in South, you know, I mean, I'm just. So, and are you sure that went from the State to everywhere else? Or maybe went from the UK to Australia, from Australia got here. Well, that's immigration. So, you know, how did this thing happen? So, this is, again, another implications. The impact of apartheid education resulted in the support during the democratic government in support for educational reform that link vocational, formal, and flexible learning. Now, quite aside from the mistake in the writing, there are two problems with this thing. First is the idea that the impact of apartheid education is something that does not require explanation, first, because, you know, it's a rather complex, yeah, is the notion of self-evident, this thing. It's not that simple. There are many things that apartheid education that have had really serious bad consequences, but there are other things that are encompassing on that are not that clear, certainly in terms of different higher education institutions, for example. So that's the one. The other one is the idea that things are not complex. The support for educational reform that linked vocational, formal, and flexible learning was far, far from being an uncontroversial issue. And as a matter of fact, of all the things, of all the policies that the government enacted since 1994, the national qualification framework and the notion of flexibility and mobility across the different bands of the curriculum was a political controversy that lasted 10 years and was only settled now with the higher education qualifications framework. So there were 20,000 reviews of the. There were 3 reviews of the NQF and commissions of inquiry and this and that and write policy and fight with this and call Michael Young and come these people from the UK and come these people from Australia and let's keep on talking, and then fight between the Department of Labor and the Department of Education, who has, you know, all of these ended up in the creation of the Department of Higher Education and Training, which meant a reshuffle of the cabinet and a reshuffling of the portfolios in the cabinet. So if we said, I scared somebody for real. If we say that there was support in relation to this thing, one has to qualify this thing. Was certainly not unconditional support. Some sectors supported it, some people did not support it. Why? How? You know. So this, we need to be careful with that. The white paper on higher education focused on the role of higher education in modern society in development. Yes, but amongst other things. So did every other blooming policy that appeared during this period in every other country. So, new. And quite frankly, let me tell you something. I suspect that often this happened because students do not read the sources. I do not know that everybody who is supposed to be reading the white paper has actually read the white paper. And I think that it is important that these things are done. You cannot talk about these things if you do not read them. It's that thing that I was telling you, you read the secondary source site and blah, blah, blah. So why? So I think that that's problematic. You need to read the policy, at least the policy that is your source. You cannot just rely on the commentary of other people. And if you had read the white paper properly, you would know that this is not true, or that this is so very partially true. The other thing that happens, and this happens in life, in analysis, in everything, is that for some reason, we seem to believe that two things which are contradictory cannot be true at the same time. So, and these things happen in all sorts of situations, happen in your relationships with the staff, happen in your relationship with your children, happen in relationship to policy, everything. So, if you said, this work is crap, I said, but you just told me that I'm very intelligent. So, the work is still crap if you are intelligent. The two things can exist simultaneously and be predicated simultaneously about the same thing. Okay? And the same thing happens in policy. The same piece of paper can have things that are said that seem contradictory, but they are true at the same time. And I think that we find very difficult to deal with that contradiction, with the paradox, with that kind of complexity. We need to hold both things simultaneously. I have somebody taking me to the CCMA because of this kind of contradictions. Anyway.
At the risk of oversimplifying, I really agree with what you said, but I'm also wondering if it's an academic writing issue. Is that academics hedge all the time? I mean, one shouldn't be making those sorts of statements really in any of our academic writing. Is it not partly that the writers haven't learned about academic writing? One doesn't make such general statements.
Look, I mean, that's
part of the issue.
That can be part of the issue. I think that no, I think that you are spot on. Actually, I think that one of the enormous problems that we have is that the quality of academic writing is very, very poor, and you need to work at this a lot, because it is through. And I absolutely understand, look, I mean, there is no secret, evidently, through this accent of mine, that English is not my first language. So I do understand and sympathize with everybody who does not have English as a birthright. And then everything is easy. And not so easy, because academic writing has its own things. Exactly. But it becomes more difficult for people who are writing a language that it is not their own. And so trying to get the grammar right, trying to make sense, and at the same time, sort of be able to sort of convey the nuance is very hard, is very, very hard. And I sort of understand this, but one has to also know that if one wants to get to a certain type of writing, and a PhD is the beginning, is the threshold of that writing, one has to go for this. I mean, I had a supervisor when I did my PhD who is probably the anti-supervisor. So if somebody wanted to write an example of the non-pedagogic supervisor, that was mine. But I like one thing about it. Because you see, one of the problems with English-speaking people in South Africa and elsewhere is that it tends to patronize those of us who do not have the language. So, I mean, like at Wits University, I was in kind of quarantine. They didn't allow me to teach black students when I came and started doing tutorials, because I was going to contaminate them with my English. So, But anyway, that's on aside, my own resentment. But anyway, this chap did not patronize me. He was absolutely brutal with me, in the same way that he would have been brutal with anybody else. So he wrote, I have kept the manuscript of my doctoral thesis for years. Every time that I thought that I was achieving something, I read it again. So you have to get a measure of yourself. So one of the famous quotes was, "This is so stupid and pedestrian that even the vice chancellor would have been able to say it." So that was a double take. But what I'm trying to say is that we all go through these things, and it's a difficult process. It is painful. Didn't kill me, probably would be in a tribunal for anti-pedagogic behavior. But actually, some of the things that are not politically correct are actually refreshing, guys. Calling a spade when you are being stupid is not such a bad thing. And I was being stupid, so I needed to be told that I was being stupid. So, you clever girl, you could do it better. No, that's crap. So why do you need to be, all the time that you sort of lose and waste in trying to calm the thing down, you can use in actually teaching how to do it right, instead of so. For me, these things are a second form of racism. But anyway, this is not about this. Okay, now life is getting complicated. Now, up to now, we have worked with the idea of policy as text. Okay? Which means policy, something that it is written, it is self-contained, it is text. Now, we are going to go into something much more complicated, which is the notion of policy as discourse, which is not just text. It includes the text, but it is not just text. Now, what is the point of departure of this? That language itself is a social structure. And in that sense, it is a structure according to a number of things, including material conditions and relationships of power. In that sense, language reflects, and it is enmeshed into those relationships of power. So it is intrinsically not neutral. So language, like policy, can become an instrument and an object of power. Now, if we understand these two things, and there's a whole lot of people who have theorized magnificently about this, when we get to policy, we can get to the next one, please. Thank you so much. Yeah.
On the material conditions, what do you mean structured by material conditions?
Well, that the language in the 19th century described the material conditions of existence of people in the 19th century, that our language has words and modes of expression and things that talk about our reality. That in the word homosexual did not appear in the English vocabulary until the 19th century, whilst homosexuality as a sexual preference existed since the Greeks and etc. So, it's normalization that exercise on a kind of thing. That's that kind of stuff. That the word innovation in the 21st century had meaning that did not have in the 18th or 19th century when the word existed, but it did not exist in the 15th century, for example. So, and so it goes. That's what I mean by materiality. Okay. So if policy is discourse, then it is not longer a thematic text in which you can read the author and the intention of the author and these kind of things. So policy then becomes discourse, which is part of a much bigger thing. It is part then of science and formal science, that's language, but also of practices. And produce social practices. Discourses produce social practices. The most common examples in the sort of things that have been studied in depth are the medicalization of poverty, for example. But in this case, the changes in the definition of what a teacher is in our policies, I'm talking about teachers at the schooling level, the seven roles of the teacher changed the practice of teaching. Not necessarily in a positive way, but changed the practice of teaching. So now we do pastoral things sometimes when we are not molesting our students, but we cannot teach them to read and write. So, but you know, policy can change practice. Give you another example. At the beginning of the administration of the higher education branch, there was this idea that institutions would have to produce 3-year rolling plans, and that they will have to review their curriculum and see what they were doing and etc. Nobody, absolutely nobody in the legislation said the universities that they have to modularize and programmatize and get rid of departments at the universities. And there they were. 90% of the institutions in the country demolished their departments, created sexy things.
And they went and said that they had to because government
And government told us. Nobody told you. That's what you read into the thing. So you see, policies change practices.
But some other universities, in fact, the reality is universities respond differently.
Absolutely.
Depending on who the agents or the people are within the university itself. Some weaker universities, in a way, are being harmed due to their positioning of actors in the struggle.
Yeah, absolutely. The university said that was not going to change and did not change. But everybody else decided that, hey, hippie, now we're going to go and do it. And then they invented all the stupid, sexy things. Anyway, never mind. So that's one thing. Then discourse is a domain of language use, and therefore has to do with the domain of the lived experience. So we are part of it. Policy is not something any longer that is outside us. It is part of the practice that we have as people involved in a particular field of practice, in this case, higher education. So the policy texts exist within a certain discursive practice, and it's a big, big thing. The discourse about higher education does not exist only in this country, exists elsewhere. There are organizations like the World Bank, like the OECD, like UNESCO, who are all the time producing ideas and policies and text on higher education, discourse on higher education. These things get published, get discussed in fora, get translated into websites, get translated into different languages. You can download the public, all of those things create a certain cultural field, if you want, in terms of higher education. So when I produce my white paper is part of that discourse. And when I translate the white paper into what happened at my institution, I'm also within the same. And then it gets even more complicated because there is also a certain discursive practice inside your institution. And how the two things talk to each other. And how the different power relations appear in different institutions and in relation to the system and all this kind of thing. Madam.
Was there white paper, green or purple or black or other paper, or does it have any specific meaning?
The white paper. We have green papers that, as its name suggests, are the sort of no, they're not environmental. There are and they mature. They completely. They become acts of parliament or legislation.
No, I'm just talking in did it also have any other connotations?
Oh no. It's just that. It's just. Well, the next. No, that's okay. This white paper is red actually, but it's because it comes from the Communist Party. Okay, the next one. It's like the tie of the minister. Have you played with a tie that is not red? Wears a tie. Always wears a tie. I need to convince him of the red overall, but that's the next one. Okay, now, and this, before I get to Bourdieu per se, and this is something I'm going to repeat until you are fed up with me, more fed up with me. The discipline, education might exist as a discipline. I have my doubts, but might exist as a discipline. Higher education is certainly not a discipline. Higher education is a field of study, that it is fundamentally multidisciplinary. So this means that if you want to play in this turf, you need to know sociology, anthropology, politics, economics, history, linguistics. Shall I continue? So, you cannot just read people who write higher education. Universities are institutions in society that have specific roles in society. So in order to understand those roles, you need frames of analysis and theorizations of society and institutions in society. So hence, you need to read everybody. And that's the fun of having a field like this, in which you can go in all sorts of directions. All of you should have read Foucault by now. All of you should have read Pierre Bourdieu. As you can see, I like the French. It's the revenge of the Latins. So, based on the notions of Pierre Bourdieu, it is important that we understand what the cultural field means in order to understand what a discursive field means, because the notion of discursive field is derived from the notion of cultural field that Bourdieu developed. And this is the idea that societies have a number of practices, which are rituals, rules, conventions, categories. Categories help you to classify things. Designations, titles, that constitute hierarchies within a society. And all of these authorize certain manners of talking and the possibility of talking about certain things. The example that I was putting earlier about sexuality. When is the discourse about sexuality possible, and when certain types of sexuality become part of the discourse? What authorizes that? The other one is, of course, madness. When madness becomes madness? When normality becomes normal? So these are and there are things that are possible to say, and there are things that are not possible. Under repressive regimes, these things are crystal clear. So there are certain things that you cannot talk about. Because, yes?
Just following this idea, France Fanon is the classic example of someone who was able to see how madness is classified according to the discourses of the culture.
Yeah.
And so his work with schizophrenia, which was not seen to be schizophrenia. But it does mean that he was able to see it as an insider-outsider, right? Being in France, now gone to
Algeria.
But if you're an insider, you don't see it.
Well, you don't see it, or you can see it. There are possibilities of seeing it, because if not, nobody would have ever been able to jump. Galileo, Giordano Bruno, they're all examples of people who existed within, I'm talking 15th century Italy, for those of you who don't have much European history in your background. So all these people challenged the Catholic Church and the world conceptualization of the universe. The organization of society was based on the notion that the earth was the center of the universe, and that the sun was moving, and that the other way around, sorry. And came Giordano Bruno and said, no, excuse me, this thing doesn't work this way. It's the other way around. The sun is the center of the solar system, and we are the ones that are running around. The guy ended up burned at the stake. But Galileo showed it with a telescope, and he lived. And then you can say it. And then things start changing, then it is possible to change. If not, revolutions would never be possible.
But I'm not saying it's impossible, because as you say, we never have progress, or we never have anything to write about. But that it's a caution about how one interprets policies,
Of course.
interpreting it from one's own discursive ability.
Of course. And I think that one has to be very, very mindful of these kind of things. It's a level of self-awareness, which I think it is very important. I find it myself, I struggle enormously myself to come to terms with some of the literature on IKS and epistemological justice and these kind of things. And I find myself fighting with my white self in these kind of things, and having to step back and come again until one gets it. Because it sort of alters the sort of the epistemic dispositive from which you are part, and I think that's important. And the point about these things is that not only these things exist, not only there are institutions that make up this sort of cultural field of which we are talking, but it is the interactions between those institutions that are also part of the cultural field. So the level of complexity is extraordinary. Hmm? So if you think in terms of higher education, if you think in terms of a structure, you have at government level, the Department of Higher Education and Training. You have some relationships with other departments, like the Department of Basic Education. You have the Department of Science and Technology. And just to name only the real cognate ones. Then you have a system of the universities. Hmm? They have the public university. They have the private universities. Then you have Parliament and the Portfolio Committee. Then you have the senates of every one of our universities and the councils of our universities. Then you have the ANC. All of this is part of this sort of mesh of a sort of discursive field or a cultural field. Let's go to the next one, please. So one of the authors I'm using, that is called Faisal Rizvi, defines discursive field based on Bourdieu's notion of cultural field. This is a very important definition. Let's go through it slowly. It's the range of assumptions that are made implicitly in debating a particular topic or issue. The ideas that are presumed, the notions that are simply ruled out of bounds of possibility, and it represents an exercise in power, establishing the universalized grounds upon which further questions are permissible and may be asked, and defining the parameters of acceptable narratives, images, voices, and perspectives. I mean, I could do an analysis of the political discourse of the country based on this. We can be here for 40 days. Talking about, no, listen to some of these things. It represents an exercise in power, establishing the universalized grounds. Telling you here that there are certain truths that are accepted. This becomes universal. So higher education has to provide access. The ANC is a transformative party that offers transformative politics in the country. These are universalized truths of which other things derive and that permit or do not permit certain others. These are the kind of, I mean, it's going to be very seldom that you guys, in the type of work that you're doing, will have to go into this complexity of analysis. Because this is the kind of analysis that will be exactly focused only on the policy. Although I'm not very sure about Mr. with his teaching and development grant thing, but I mean, or in terms of the governance story. I mean, I need to see more of what it is that you're trying to do. It is important that you understand that there is a level of complexity of these things that should be a health warning not to treat these things lightly. That's basically what I'm suggesting. This does not imply that now you need to go and read discourse analysis and all of that in order to write your PhD, although it's not a bad it's not a bad thing to do as a occupation. But I think that you need to see these things. Let's go to the next one. I'm not going to cover everything. Okay, so this is important. And the purpose of higher education as an act is the denaturalization. Is the denaturalization of the text. So, I mean, in relation to higher education, if you come through higher education and higher education has not changed your life, your manner of thinking, etc., you should ask for your money back. But in terms of text, it's the idea that the text masks the sources of its status and its authority. So you need to scratch that surface and see under the surface where does the authority and the power of the text come from. So the idea is that shows how the discourse defines the positions. Who listens, who talks, and when. And then it defines also subjectivities. The text creates things. The text creates the teacher as a, what is it? The educator. The text creates the student as a learner. The text creates the client. So how do we deal with that? And of course, through those definitions of subjectivities comes the allocation of resources. Can we do the next one, please? Okay. Now, so far, I gave you the most heavy theoretical aspect. There are different approaches to look at this, and there are some things that are very informed by theory, but at the same time are very practical. And in these years of my going through literature in these areas and trying to teach students about these things and whatever, I came across an Australian author called Carol Bucky. And I call Australian, she's not Australian, she evidently comes from an Italian family, who has developed a theory or an approach to policy analysis that it is called what is the problem represented to be. I find it useful to explain to students and also to use it myself, how to tackle actual policy analysis, okay? So, the point of departure of this, like with discourse, and she's heavily influenced by discourse theory and Foucault's work and etc., is that policy, like discourse, creates a problem, defines a problem, okay? So what we need to understand is what is it the problem that the policy is defining? This is the million-dollar question, so to speak. Usually, when a policy comes to life, is indicating that certain change is needed, okay? In defining that change is defining the nature of a problem, okay? If you said, the examples in the medical sciences are easier, but I mean, if you said that we need to get our nation to eat better because we have an unhealthy diet, and therefore the change that you expect is that people are going to eat less carbs and more vegetables and protein. Yeah, well, not necessarily with 4 legs, but anyway, yeah. So, what you are saying, how you construct the issue of the diet of people, or why are people, which is the obsession of the country lately. We have a problem with obesity and we have a problem with diabetes. How do you construct this is very, very important in the manner in which you sort of talk about the policy, because suddenly what we are going to realize is that these poor people who are eating pap and bread are eating pap and bread because they have a bad diet. They don't understand how to be healthy, not because they are poor, because they don't know how to be healthy. So what is the solution to the bad diet? Not having people poor, but teach poor people to eat rich people food. So that's a very stupid way of proceeding in a policy. So do you know what I mean? So this is trying to understand what is the problem represented to be. The second step is to ask, what presuppositions or assumptions underline the representation of the problem. What is there? Let's go to higher education. Let's say that we are concerned about skills, as we are. The country is concerned about lack of skills. So what informs the concern about lack of skills? The notion that if you are skilled, you would be employed. Therefore, it's a conception of unemployment that it is you are unemployed because you don't have the skills that are required in society. What this thing is not telling us is that, by definition, the capitalist system needs a floating mass of people who are unemployed. So it doesn't matter how many skills you have, we need a mass of unemployed people. So, there is a little trick in there about, we are skilling you in order to be unskilled unemployed within this system. How does the representation of the system come about? This is what the history of the problem is. Where does it come from? How does it come that suddenly we are so concerned about skills? How does it come that suddenly we are so concerned about everybody going to higher education? Why higher education has become a issue of classification? And evolution in the socioeconomic structure of our society has taken place that makes higher education a necessary or seemingly necessary element in order for us to function in society. Let's go to the next one. What is left unproblematic in the representation? What things are not being said? What are the silences? Would it be possible to think this differently? And most of the time, yes, it is possible to think this differently. But there is an investment of values, an ideology, and politics. So this is the thing. No policy is neutral. No policy is neutral. And then, what effects are produced by this representation of the problem? So, people are going to stop eating pap. Imaginary, of course, or unimaginary. But you know what I mean? So everybody is going to want to go to higher education in order to get a skill. So what are the effects that these things have? What does the effect that the medicalization of poverty has? And then, of course, the last step is how, well, I think it is the last step, how or where has this representation of the problem being produced, disseminated, and defended? So who embraces this thing? And can you change it? Is there an alternative you can possibly actually have and enact and have it happening? In my experience, there are a whole lot of alternatives for the things that we do that we never think about it, because we are almost locked into the possibilities that have been somehow legislated for us. A question I myself ask when I write about policy and when I do policy analysis, which is part of the job that I do, is what is the problem to which this policy is purported to be a solution? So in that way, I took on the differentiation framework that the government was going to take, the new regulation for reporting of higher education institutions. Because if you ask, what is it? What problem is this thing trying to address? You often realize that there is a mismatch also between the actual problem that it is sort of being, that the government is trying to address, and the actual policy that is being put out. I mean, the latest legislation in terms of higher education reporting is a very good case in point. The colleagues in the Department of Education know about it, or not. Now, this is at the level of the policy production, okay? Now, what happens when the policy is produced? And we come to the actual more concrete aspects of policy implementation. When a policy is out there, I think that the questions that you need to ask yourself is, what is taken up by whom? Because the policies are usually not taken up holus bolus. People pick and choose what they want. So what is taken up by whom, when, and how? I mean, I can tell you that out of 23 higher education institutions in the country, not 2 have the same interpretation and take up of the quality assurance policy. Every institution took quality assurance policies according to their idiosyncrasies, their internal politics, their needs, their power structures, etc. What are the institutional constraints to policy implementation? For example, the government has just decided in their wisdom that all institutions are going to produce something that it is called an integrated report. An integrated report is a type of reporting that corporations do, that businesses do, that combines goals, objectives, bottom line, social responsibility, and the actual financial viability of an institution, the financial statement of an institution, which is not a bad idea if that was done properly. But who has the capacity to do that at the institutions? It requires a hell of a lot of work and integration of processes at higher education institutions in order to be able to do this. So not everybody can implement the policy completely. So people will implement as far as they can, or this is also something that we do and it is perfectly legitimate, or pretend you're implementing it. So you change the title of your usual report, and now instead of calling annual report of the Department of Higher Education, call the integrated report of University of Venda. And because nobody in the Department of Education, despite the colleague, are going to read it, nobody's going to realize that you actually are cheating. So, you know, these are the kind of things that happen in this regard. So not everybody can do these things. Now, continuing this type of reasoning, when you do this, what is the effect that this thing has, for example, in terms of how differentiation and advantage and disadvantage in the South African higher education system pans out? Advantaged institutions are going to have the resources to do this, either because they are going to do it or because somebody is going to hire somebody else in order to come and do it for them. So all the integrated reports are going to be written by consultants who are going to specialize. So the, what's the name? Water Coopers and etc. are going, KPMG and all of them are going to have a new department, the integrated report for higher education department, and are going to charge phenomenal amount of money to everybody to go and do. And the institutions that are cash strapped, etc., are not going to be able to do this, or they do not have the personnel to do it. So, what is the downstream implication of these things? Policy translation is key in the understanding of implementation, which is what we were talking about when I was mentioning the issue of the operational plans or the 3-year rolling plans. People interpret things, and sometimes the things that they interpret are not necessarily in the policy. They overinterpret just in case. Afrikaans, historically, Afrikaans institutions are a great example of these things. I mean, in the gratitude not to have been slapped completely by the national government in 1994, they went in an over-implementation drive. So there were the universities that first changed the titles of everything was for transformation. And they had all sorts of policies and things that went into this sort of renewal of things. In title only, but I mean, but they did it. So it's a matter of how these things get translated. I mean, we never had a more disciplined response to the quality assurance drive than the one provided by historically Afrikaans institutions. The University of Pretoria had everything that we wanted there. The University of Stellenbosch had a sort of library of things. The University of Northwest, ditto. The University of Free State, needless to say. At UCT, we need to, excuse me, can we please come and do this? So, so it's different positions of these things. The UCTs, the VETs, the Rhodes of the felt that they could put a much sort of a stronger face and said, well, we do not necessarily agree with this quality assurance crap that you're trying to impose on us. And what does this mean, and how do we negotiate it?
Isn't that also speaking with the culture of the institution, the
Sure.
roles that they've been playing throughout the history during the apartheid? What roles were they playing? Were they serving as machinery for the apartheid government?
Yeah, no, of course. Look, I mean, institutional cultures and the role that institutions have had in different stages of our histories are still existing and still with us. Not in the same ways, but I mean, of course there are. But I mean, there is a common mistake to think that the only institutions that play a role under apartheid were the white institutions, because the institutions also play a huge role for apartheid. And I think that that's something that we need to process, because that culture is still there too. Very and I think that that's a history that needs to be written about that. And that's interesting.
Again, the intention was not to create kind of universities that don't create people that will challenge the status quo of the authorities.
No, of course it was not. The intention was to create the bureaucracy for the homelands that was going to keep the status quo going. That was the intention. In the same way that the idea of creating a university that were to keep a particular culture going, and the buoyancy of Afrikaans as a language also. But these things are very, very complex in their layers now, particularly now, at this stage. The manner in which these historical realities act in the present moment is much more complex than just classifications and simplistic ideas of advantage and disadvantage and all these kind of things. It's got much more complicated, so the policy analysis has to be very, very refined in relation to these things. Every time that you think that you got it right, you're challenged by some major data.
I'm hoping that's what will come out of some of Nico's presentations. Just the moment you think you understood the institutional context, and thereby can say something like, this is something that shows you.
No, I mean, there are surprises. There are ridiculous things. Isn't one kind of, let me give you some examples of my own institution. I work at the University of the Free State. 70% of our students are black. 70% of our students prefer to be taught in English. And that 70% includes some students for whom Afrikaans is their first language. I have a language policy that says that we are a parallel medium institution. And I have a bunch of very conservative Afrikaner people who want us to keep on having the parallel language. And there are, one could discuss reasons why this is the case. The majority of my students are at my university, not only because it is a regional, it sort of has a fairly regional catchment area, but also because it is a comparatively cheap institution. many of my students are very poor students. So much so, the university has organized a campaign in order to ensure that the students are not hungry. So it is true the institution is advantage when you look at the infrastructure. The institution is advantage, but it's not catering for advantage. You know, the majority of the population in our institution is not advantaged, not even the sons and daughters of the farmers of the Free State. They're not exactly your rich kids that go to Stellenbosch or something. Do you know what I mean? Reality has become much more complicated once social mobility has become more possible. So one has to be very, very careful when one analyzes policy, not to shoot ourselves into notions of polarity and binaries that are very, very unproductive. And that's the difficulty, going back to the earlier conversation, about the writing of academic text. Because you need to hold on to these complexities. You need to hold on. I saw that you were reacting to the UCT commentary. Well, I mean, here we are going to have a sort of a framework dispute. I'm sure that your supervisors and colleagues here who work within sort of the critical realist approach can answer the technical aspects of the question. I do not believe that policy operates only at one level, you see. Policy operates throughout the structures. And that's the reason why I find a more productive way of looking at these things from Bourdieu or Foucault or whoever, Laclau, whoever it is we are talking about. Because I think that these separations, although they are useful heuristically, do not operate in reality.
And they're not, nobody says they do. Is a heuristic.
Yes, but the problem, yeah, but I mean, the problem with these things is that, as far as I've seen some of the products, the heuristic thing is not overcome sufficiently in the synthesis. So this is the risk with these things. Because they look simple. Well, I mean, hell, I mean, I sat in I did a reading group of Archer at the Free State. Not getting people to understand how it works is difficult. But it gets to a moment in which it becomes simplified. Because in reality what happens is that there is a dilution. It's a dilution between Archer and the mediation of Archer at church or at wherever. So what the students get is not Archer, it's the mediation. I'm sorry, I'm talking as a friend and as a reader.
But I think that's almost any complex theory that could happen. And that goes back to your thing about you've got to go back and read the original text.
But I think anyone has to go back and read the original text. But also, I think that it would be useful if one could offer a variety of points of entry into this type of analysis. Because not all, but most of the analyses that are going to be done will be done within a different framework. So there is a whole lot of social theory, very new social theory that is pushing some of these things now. So you can get a dialogue between these things. And you know that's a possibility. But the issue, again, going back to your very punctual question, policy operates as all levels. Because from the Vice Chancellor to the lecturer at the classroom level, the lecturer might not know what the hell the policy is. But, you know, at least at the HOD level, people will not know what the policy is. And they will have their own interpretation of it. And so it operates at all.
And then it operates outside of the people as well, because it operates at a sort of cultural, ideological level, which is enacted by people, of course. But I think it's worth looking at those slightly separately and saying, well, how is the department talking about it? How's it? You often hear academics saying, oh, well, the government says we have to do this and this and this, you know. So that's how they've made sense of what they've been told at some meeting. But then at a cultural level, and that goes back to Sarah's point, it was coming into an institution with a particular cultural understanding of its relationship with the state or its relationship to students, how students are failing because they're unprepared or whatever.
Yeah.
That cultural understanding, I think that also affects how the policy gets read by the individual.
Completely. That's the reason why you do not exist outside the cultural field. I mean, also there was some Argentinian professor that used to have a very good metaphor. I will not tell.
Just going to piggyback on what you're saying, when you take, for instance, the aid policy, the access and redress policy of this institution, right? And structurally what it looks like and how our lecturers, our recruitment people need to enact that, what they do, and then culturally how that interplays when we bring in our young students. They come in, and then you have that the cultural, structural friction between. So it runs through all the structures, and the interplay is there.
Of course, these things are there all the time, but again, these things say what it is possible and what it is not possible. What kind of conversations you can have and what kind of conversations you cannot have. The things that you address directly and the things that you do not address directly. It reflects the manner of address of certain things. So there are many ways of looking at these things, but it is very it's the complexity of the whole process that I hope I have been able to sort of imprint in your heads. To the next one, so fast because I cannot. Oh, okay. I think that I want to run very quickly through this. Basically, among the many authors, and I will give you a list of the authors that I use, Roger Day deals particularly well with the issue of diffusion and traveling policies. You know, how a policy is originated in a particular way, travels and gets changed and etc. But rereading Roger Day, I thought to myself that some of the things that he suggests in terms of how to read the local, global tensions and interactions can also be interesting to be reinterpreted in relation between in the relationship between the system and the institutional level, or the top of the authority in the pyramid and what happens at the sort of lecture level. I mean, I experienced this in myself at my own institution in a number of ways. I'll give you the example just now. But I mean, the idea is, to what extent are reforms accepted voluntarily? People embrace the same. It's not coercion. How explicit this process of embracing is, or the process of sort of adopting a certain kind of policy. To what extent the reform is influenced externally? Did we go into all the higher educational reform that we did just our own bat, or because we were also being influenced by the rise of neoliberalism in the rest of the world? There is the issue of this is said fancifully, but I mean it's the locus of viability of mechanisms. To see, is it possible in this place? And what things are possible in this place that are not possible in other places, and what trade-off are going to happen there? By what processes external influence is introduced? Go to the next, please. If there is an initiation, who or what is the source of initiation of that reform? And then there are the degrees of power in this type of relationship. Is this naked power? It's just an invasion a la Bush? Or is there an influence in terms of agenda setting, like the OECD will have, or that the UNESCO is more benign, will have a sort of an agenda setting kind of influence. But the OECD, if it comes to do a review of what you're doing, might have a much stronger influence in your policies. Who has ability to control the rules of the game? Do you have the ability to control the rules of the game, or are the rules of the game being controlled externally? And how externally introduced change is mediated. You see, all these questions that are asked in relation to international policy, so to speak, can be asked in relation to the quality assurance policy and institution X. So these things are sort of usable in different ways. I think that one would have to theorize this much more. I mean, I just thought about it as I was preparing this conversation. Okay, I'm getting to the end, don't despair. I mean, at least I think I'm getting to the end. Wait. Yeah. No, I am. Okay, these are sort of just some of a general advice kind of thing. This is the back page of the whatever, the Fair Lady. Think in terms of political process. Don't ever think just in terms of an event. What you have in front of you is something that came out of a policy/political process. Think in terms of what the politics were in the production, the implementation of a policy, and in the actual purposes and language that the text has. It is very, very interesting to work through the meanings and the manner in which the same thing is rendered from text to text. I've done some work on transformation as a concept, and it is actually fascinating to see how transformation is defined over 20 years of democracy. Then is the issue of what are the compromises that one arrives at in policy. There has to be some level of consensus. There has to be some level of legitimacy. You mentioned this thing at the beginning. There has to be legitimacy and consensus. So how is the consensus arrived at? So why is it that, just to give you an example, we have such a strong defense of private property in the constitution of the country? Because this is part of the settlement, the political compromise that we had in the transition to democracy.
And then who's benefiting and who's kind of disadvantaged by the system? It's also interesting.
Absolutely. Those of us who can buy bulls, for example, benefit enormously for the possibility that we have of buying and land and etc. It's absolutely like that. So that creates the possibility of a status quo and of a very small bottleneck into which some people get access.
Then you start talking about this concept, consensus. For me, it's very problematic because of the power relations within reaching that setting.
Of course.
So
Of course.
those who are in the position of power, in terms of exposure, in terms of understanding, some of the things some people cannot see, they are naked eye. They always position themselves in a position that will preserve their interests.
Absolutely. That's the problem of consensus in democracies that do not have sufficient access and participation. Because there's always somebody that it is out of the consensus because it doesn't have the voice.
But interestingly, and that's what I found so interesting, Edwin Cameron's presentation, he was arguing, and I never thought of it like this, he was arguing for that at times. Because he said the inclusion in terms of diversity, race, gender, sexual orientation in our constitution, he said that was a minority voice.
Of course it was.
And he was saying now there's something like 37% of South Africans in some big poll are in favor of the right to same-sex marriage. And you're saying 37%? That's brilliant. That's more than we've ever had. And yet arguing, so it's just interesting to say that this whole, it seems obvious to us that consensus is a good thing and that because not everyone has a voice, that's a bad thing. But then he used that example, which challenged me in interesting ways.
Yeah, but I mean, no, but it is. But again, this is a political issue. Yeah, of idealizing and thinking that the majority mistake. If you give voice to the majority of this country, they would go and kill capital and it will beat us, all of us gay people. So we don't need that. So these are the kind of things that one has to. So is democracy a bad thing? That, of course not, but I mean, you know what I'm saying.
It really says to me we really need a very literate society.
Absolutely.
Because there are things that normally take for granted.
Exactly. And the issue about women's rights. I mean, if you put it to the vote in this country, the kind of rights for women that would be sort of voted for them. So, I mean, we will be lucky if we can manage to keep the vote. Okay, next. Oh, okay. Now, I told you this at the beginning, and I'm going to say it. You are in a multidisciplinary field. You cannot do policy analysis only knowing your little whatever topic is. And I'm not saying little topic in a sort of dismissing way. But if you are studying a particular curricular problem, that cannot be the whole horizon of what you study, or what you know, rather. Might be the horizon of what you study, but cannot be the horizon of what it is that you know. You need to be able to move further. You need to be able to move further theoretically, and you need to be able to move further empirically. So a PhD implies the theories and methods and whatever that belong to your field. It means that you make theories, that you make choices apropos of all of those things. But also means that you're pushing the boundaries of knowledge. So if you are not producing new knowledge, don't kid yourself. Even if you get the PhD, you don't have one. No, I'm being serious. I'm being serious. Because we need to produce some level of new knowledge, some new theorization, or some really new starting empirical evidence. A PhD is not about applying a recipe to a new situation. That's a master's. So remember that when you do your thing. What is it new that you are producing that is going to be pushing, to some extent, the field of knowledge in which you are? You don't need to be a Nobel Prize, for heaven's sakes. I'm not talking about sort of now come a new theory of relativity in higher education. But I mean, So please do not forget that. Read, and read. Know history. Know at least the history of your own country. I mean, young people are, you're, with respect, you're not all that young looking. Some of you are very young looking, others are not so young. So those of us older people have a sense of history, either because we study history and we live through it. But the younger generation is promptly forgetting, amongst other things, because all these public holidays now have absolutely sort of legitimation type names. Now you have Youth Day. So you ask Youth Day, what is Youth Day? And now the new generation is never going to know again that once there was an uprising in Soweto, and what were the reasons for that uprising. Just to give one example. So be aware of the history of your country. There are amazingly nice and good books and articles in history to read. Okay, this is the list of some of the, this is not an exhaustive list. These are some of the people that have helped me torture you for this morning, okay? So these are very interesting people. There are very nice books and very nice articles published by these people. Read them. They are not easy. Some of them are more difficult than others. And they have themselves a very nice, interesting list of bibliography at the back. The nice thing of writing a PhD is that one becomes a chaser of lists of bibliography, okay? So you can get your tree bigger and bigger and bigger. Okay, and that, okay. Health warning. None of what I said means that after you leave this room, you know how to do a policy analysis. Okay? This is not sufficient. If I happen to be an external examiner, a critical reader or whatever of your thesis, and you quote the slide presentation, you can be absolutely sure that you will fail. Okay? Do not quote a slide presentation. Power corrupts. PowerPoint presentations corrupt infinitely. Okay? So they shouldn't exist. So you need to read the references. Okay? Next. The Bachi thing that I show you is interesting and is good. It's not the recipe. If you follow the 6, 7 steps of Bachi, you still can get it wrong. And actually, I will risk you will get it wrong unless you have all the other background. Okay? And I think that that's it. Yeah. That's the only part of. Okay, and I think that that's. I hope that it was not too offensive. So.